Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Today we're going to talk about how you as a new Linux user can find the distribution that's going to work for you in your implementation as you experiment with the Linux world. So with this, we kind of want to just talk about a few of the little issues, just some things to think about. There's no one person that's going to tell you absolutely under every case, use this distribution. Well, there might be people that try, but I would definitely say no one's going to tell you exactly what you should run. You shouldn't just say, oh, Switch to Linux says use this, so use this. I would just test out a few different distributions and a few different platforms to find what works best for you. There's not an absolute perfectly right or wrong in this, but I'm going to give you a little bit of guidelines and tips that I use when I'm deciding which distribution I want to plan for any individual computer. So the first thing I always recommend here is stick with one of your major distributions. So your major distributions, of course, we have Arch, and there's a few different what I'd call major distributions in the Arch world, and there's more always coming up here, but we have things like Manjaro, we have Arch Labs, we have Arco Linux. These are all distributions which have a very high degree of success rate among users in the Linux community that are all based on Arch. And we'll get into why you'd want to run Arch versus Debian or something else in a little bit later. Now, if you wanted to run something like Debian, of course you could run Debian. It is not the most user-friendly distribution, but you can get it installed without a lot of hassle. Now, if you want to stick in that general family and you want to be close to Debian but have a little bit more user-friendly experience, MX Linux is a great place to go. That distribution is based on Debian but has a lot of user-friendly system tools in there. We also have Ubuntu, which is overall, it's a good distribution. It's starting to fall a little bit more out of favor just because they're moving a lot more towards what seems to be corporate interest. Not entirely, and it's still up for question or debate, but overall, they are very user-friendly distributions. They come in a variety of flavors, which means they have different desktop environments, meaning your computer will look and behave a little bit different. We'll get into that in a little bit here as well. And anything in the Ubuntu family is generally going to work fairly well on a lot of hardware. Now, my personal favorite is Linux Mint because it uses an Ubuntu core, adds a few other things that I think make it run a little bit better and even a little bit more stable, but it has a desktop environment that Ubuntu doesn't have that lays out everything the exact way I personally like to use my computer. And that's why I like that one particularly. You also have Solus, which is a pretty good choice. We have Fedora, OpenSUSE, and I'm sorry, I'm probably missing a few other ones that are out there as well. But these are kind of your major family branches. Now, some people talk about there being way too many distributions, fragmentation. Some people think it's a bad thing. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's good if individual people want to customize their own system and throw out what they're doing for someone else to use. Sometimes, though, you get a distribution that is really nothing more than a different theme or one or two pieces of software installed, and that raises some question or concern. In general, if something's not a huge Linux distribution, I generally would say probably want to avoid it a little bit, just because it's not going to have, it may not have everything working the way it should be. Community support, if you're looking for fixes to that particular distro, may be lacking. But if it's something like Ubuntu or a Linux Mint or a Debian or an Arch, you're going to find the solutions that you need for anything that you need to. We should say at this point in time that in 2019 here, when I'm recording this, Linux has come so far that it's not any longer a case where you got to find a distribution that's just going to work because most of them won't. For the most part, anything that you're going to try and install on your computer is actually going to work out well for you. That's just a generality. You will still find a few pieces of hardware here and there that do not have as good a support out of the box. That's a reality. That does happen in the Windows world too, by the way. Although most of your computers that you buy with Windows come pre-installed with everything it needs, so it doesn't feel like as bad of a excuse. But if you've ever tried to install Windows from scratch, even in the Windows 10 era, there's times that you will find some hardware issues. So with that out of the way, First point is just stick to your major distributions. The second is consider what hardware you're installing it on. If you have the absolute brand new latest cutting edge software, or excuse me, hardware, you're going to want to stay in the Arch family. The reason is the Debian family, which is going to include your Ubuntu's, your Linux Mints. These generally do not ship with the absolute latest Linux kernels, which you are going to need with the cutting edge hardware. Arch does out of the box. And so if you're on the latest Ryzen processors, you're going to have a better experience on Arch than you are going to be on Debian. And I personally, my computer runs an older Ryzen. I have not had really any problems with any Linux distributions. So that's something to keep in mind. But for the most part, consider your hardware. Latest cutting edge hardware, you want to steer more towards the Arch, maybe more towards the Fedora, which also has some of the latest. And if you're having something that's not super old but not super new, just a mediocre run-of-the-mill machine within the last couple of years, you're going to be fine on anything with Debian. As far as OpenSUSE, they do have some older and some newer supporting ones. For the most part, OpenSUSE should be good on anything, probably. It is not the most user-friendly distribution. Just be aware of that as well. So with the hardware out of the way, let's talk about the purpose of your computer. If your task of your computer is to experiment with all the latest hardware and stuff, you want to go with Arch. If you're going to be just doing something to browse the internet, check your email, it really doesn't matter which distribution you're using. At that point in time, you're kind of going to be thinking about your desktop environments. And your desktop environments really determine how much memory your system is using. And so if you have a low-spec computer, like my writing computer is an Lenovo S21E, it's a little onboard 2 gig RAM. It has, I think, a dual-core low-end processor. That thing works perfectly fine with Peppermint installed. You could also try MX Linux or Linux Lite because those are kind of low-spec software. I would not want to try and run Cinnamon on it like what I run on all of my production systems. Now, if I have a general all-purpose computer, then depending on the age of it, so like I have a Dell with a Core i5 5th generation. That one there I run Cinnamon. It's 8 gigs of RAM. I'm not going to have any problem with really anything. So with that computer, though, I need to be highly productive since it's a computer I travel with. And so with that particular computer, what I end up actually doing with it is I want a layout that's much like Windows. That's why I choose Linux Mint on that. And also Peppermint has a very similar layout as well. If your purpose is games or maybe watching videos, or you're not doing a lot of multitasking, something like a GNOME-based computer might be good. That gets us more into the desktop environment versus Linux distro, but just something to keep in mind. So think of the purpose of the computer. And then the last part is your look and your feel. This again gets down into the desktop environment. How do you want the system to look and behave? In reality, any desktop can generally be installed on any Linux distro, but if you are new to Linux, you want to pick a distribution that has a desktop layout that you want. Now, some of them, like Arch Labs, and I have not experimented with Arco, but I believe they have this as well. You can choose which desktop environments you have. The same thing comes with GNOME. Ubuntu, they have, I think, 6 different community editions, so you can choose which one of those you want to use. Linux Mint, my favorite, has only 3 different desktop environments, so we're a little bit more limited. Fedora, you have a lot more. If you like a Mac-type look to it, you have Elementary with Pantheon is a good option for there. So there's a variety of things to consider in the look and the feel. So first and foremost, to summary, I prefer sticking with your major Linux distributions rather than going to some small, obscure one just out of the box. Consider what your hardware is. The latest cutting-edge hardware, you're not going to install a Debian-based distribution on it as easily as you're going to an Arch-based distribution. The purpose of your computer, if you need a lot of custom things, custom hardware, Arch is probably going to be better with the Arch user repository for extra drivers versus Debian, maybe a little bit more limited for you. Generic purpose, it's really not going to matter for you. Just experiment with a few different distributions to see what you like. And then finally decide the look and the feel, which is more in the range of the desktop environments and less in the range of your lessen the range of your distribution as a whole, but it still is a consideration to take. So that being said, let me know your thoughts on choosing your Linux distributions in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date as when we are releasing videos, and have a look at the links in the description down below.